Welcome to our presentation entitled Equitable Implementation Taking Action. I'm Karen Ward, the director of the SISEP TA Center, and I'm joined in this presentation by my fellow colleagues, Sophia Farmer and Kathleen Ryan Jackson. And I'm also really pleased to introduce two of our state partners, the great state of Kentucky, where we're going to hear from Amanda Waldrop, and the great state of New Jersey, where we're going to hear from Shimobi Matua and Phoebe Thomas as they share their equitable implementation stories. So we're going to talk today about equitable implementation and what does that really look like when we take action? What does that look like from a concrete doing the work perspective? So let's first define, what do we mean by equitable implementation? We say that equitable implementation occurs when strong equity components, including explicit attention to the culture, the histories, the values, the assets, and the needs of the community that we're working with, that we integrate those into the principles and the tools of implementation science to facilitate quality use of the effective practices and programs. So remember, in implementation science, we say that there are three critical factors for successful implementation and achieving those socially significant outcomes that we're wanting. And in each one of those factors, we need to be attending to equity and bringing to life equitable implementation. The first factor is effective practices. The second factor being effective implementation, and the third factor being enabling context. All three factors are needed to produce those socially significant outcomes. Let's first look at that first factor of effective practices. What are those questions that we're asking? And then Kentucky and New Jersey are going to share how are they assuring that they're attending to equity as they think about effective practices and do that and attend to the work of that factor. So with effective practices, we are asking ourselves the questions of what works, for whom, why, and in what circumstances. And we're really needing to pay close attention to the contextual fit. That is that match between those evidence-based practices and the strategies and the procedures that we're using to help support the use of them with the needs and the skills and the experiences and the culture and the values of those who are experiencing the practice and program. Not only the students who are experiencing, but also those that are supporting the use of the practice and using it themselves. So another question we need to ask ourselves is, whose practice is it that we're supporting? So let's take a moment now and hear from Kentucky and New Jersey as they share how they're attending to equity within that component, that factor of effective practices.
Hello, my name is Amanda Waldrop, and I'm from the Kentucky Department of Education, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Division of IDEA Implementation and Preschool. And I'm going to share with you Kentucky's implementation story. So in Kentucky, one of our first steps was to identify our area of focus. We conducted a data and infrastructure analysis with a diverse team of stakeholders, and what we found was that 80% of students with disabilities were not proficient in middle school mathematics. So we set a goal to reduce novice performance in middle school math because we know we have to do this first before we can reach our ultimate goal of increasing proficiency for students with disabilities. And we're specifically focusing on improving outcomes for students with disabilities in the elementary and middle school general education setting, because in Kentucky, over 70% of students with disabilities are in the general education setting, 80% or more of the day, and we know that math is cumulative, so we wanted to include both the elementary and middle school levels.
The first thing that we set out to do was put the formula for success in place. And so you can see that listed here. And so the way that we did that is we started off, with thinking about math. So when we started, conducting that infrastructure analysis, we determined that we really did not have a quality standard for mathematics in Kentucky. And so we're like, well, we probably need to get that moving. So what we did is we developed a representative group of stakeholders. We developed a team and to help, and we brought folks together to come to our common philosophy of what does good quality math instruction look like in Kentucky to support students with disabilities. And so through that process, we were able to develop the Kentucky Mathematics Innovation Practice Profile, which clearly operationalizes and defines what does effective math instruction look like in our state. From there, we then set out to focus on effective implementation. So we developed implementation teams at each level of the system that are focused on putting the active implementation frameworks in place to support teachers to ultimately impact student outcomes. And through that process, we used the capacity assessments to really help guide us in terms of how to put that infrastructure in place. And one thing I want to point out to you about this data in Kentucky, what's really interesting is this blue line here, and I know it might be a little hard to see. This is our state capacity assessment data over time, and you can see we've got, regions, districts, we've got a middle school and elementary school in here. But what's really interesting is in Kentucky, we've had some leadership turnover over the years throughout this work, and so you can start to see those dips in the data with the capacity assessment because of that turnover. But what's really cool about it is that despite us having that turnover at the state level, by having those implementation teams in place, that really helped. It didn't really impact them too much at the regions, district, and school level. And so that's really the power of implementation teams and putting those implementation teams in place, is that they are able for that sustainability component, and they're able to continue to move the work forward despite us at the state level having some turnover. One thing I also want to say just briefly about the implementation teams too, and the power of those, is that practice to policy piece. One thing that happened in Kentucky is, we really wanted to support our districts, our regions, districts, and schools on using implementation data to inform their decisions to support teachers. And so one of the things that, in terms of practice to policy that occurred is our districts had said, we need a one-stop shop for data collection. We need a way to be able to access implementation data in an easy manner. And so based on that practice to policy feedback, they had informed us that they needed that data system. So we decided to work with our Office of Education Technology to help us build a data dashboard that measures training, coaching, fidelity, capacity, also student benchmark data. And there's several other measures that are also incorporated within that, so that teams have all the data that they need to make informed decisions to support teachers. Which leads me into the next piece about how teams use data. So I just described for you our data dashboard. And so at this phase here, we have the training data. So teams, this is aligned to the math practice profile. So the training data helps us to inform, how the trainings are going. Have they been effective? Is there anything that could be done differently? It also informs adult learning strategies in terms of what adult learning strategies are being used to ensure that we can meet the needs of participants and teachers. We also have, it also measures the frequency as far as which particular practices within that practice profile we're focusing in on more than possibly others. And so that just gives us a good gauge as far as how our training's occurring. We also have coaching data as well. The coaching data, we have a log to help us to determine how often is coaching occurring. We have a teacher survey so that teachers can provide us feedback on how the coaching is going. And then we also have fidelity data as well, which helps us to measure how those 8 teaching practices are being implemented in the classroom, which are those components within the practice profile, and how can we support teachers on those practices. And one thing I want to say is, in Kentucky, we did not have a fidelity measure initially, and so we started using SysEP's observation tool for instructional supports and systems, and that was a huge learning for us, and that was a great process for us to begin to use that OTIS, because it allowed us to figure out how to have a fidelity system within our state. And so through that learning, we were actually able to develop the Kentucky Mathematics Innovation Tool, which is our version of a fidelity measurement that measures the components within the practice profile. And so I want to give a huge shout out to SysEP, because we had learned so much through that OTIS process that really enabled us to then develop a fidelity measure aligned to the practice profile.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Chimobi Amuta, and I am the Data Visualization Expert for the Office of Comprehensive Support for the New Jersey Department of Education. I also serve as one of the State Transformation Specialists, or STSs, for the SISEP initiative of the New Jersey Department of Education. Wanted to talk to you a bit today about how we've used data in our ongoing work to inform what our focal area is regarding our SISEP initiative in New Jersey, and how we got to where we're presently at. So we initially started by looking at all of our comprehensive schools in New Jersey. Like every state, we identify comprehensive and targeted schools, and we have a list of schools that we looked at their annual school plan, the plan that they submit to us every year that says what they're going to try to accomplish in terms of their SMART goals across 4 cycles for the instructional year. So we looked at where our schools were at in terms of meeting their goals, whether they met them or did not meet them over the course of the school year that we looked at. So after looking at that, we also looked at the proficiency and growth of all of our comprehensive schools. We looked at their ELA proficiency and their math proficiency. And then for growth, we use Student Growth Percentile, or SGP, which is our value added measure to demonstrate students' growth year over year for their cohort peers in terms of performance across the state. So we looked at that school-wide as well as for students with disabilities in every one of our comprehensive schools. And then we also looked at what those gaps were like between where our students were performing in comprehensive schools and where our students were performing statewide in New Jersey. Following proficiency and growth, we looked at graduation rate in the same way. We looked at graduation rate school-wide for all of our comprehensive schools in New Jersey, and then we also looked at the average for our students with disabilities in our comprehensive schools. We did that same comparison for students across the state, and we saw where the gaps were at in our school versus across the different schools that are throughout New Jersey. Finally, we looked at chronic absenteeism and suspension rate as well. So we looked at the school-wide rate for chronic absenteeism as well as the school-wide rates for suspension for all of our comprehensive schools. We also had that data available for our students with disabilities, so we disaggregated it across that subgroup. We saw those gaps there as well. So from that, we came up with looking at ELA performance at K through 3 for students with disabilities as our focal area after this exhaustive look at data and going across all of our different schools and looking at the gaps between where our comprehensive schools were at versus where our students were at statewide.
Okay, now that we heard Kentucky and New Jersey share a little bit about how they attend to effective practices, let's look at that second factor of effective implementation. In the second factor of effective implementation, we're talking about what are those visible supports in terms of how do we build the competency of our people that are using the practice and ensuring that the organizational and the leadership processes are in place to support high quality use of that practice or program. And how do we ensure that those supports are being transitioned to building internal capacity, meaning that our schools and our districts themselves can internally support the ongoing use of, say, the professional learning and the coaching and those other implementation supports that are needed to support their educators and their staff using the practice. So now let's hear from the great state of Kentucky and Amanda as she talks about what their effective implementation supports are and how that is using an equitable approach as they go forward.
And so in Kentucky, we use a nonlinear stage-based process because typically research has found that an organization will adopt a practice or a program, skip right to initial implementation, only to abandon it because it was not effectively used. But in Kentucky, we wanted to change that narrative. So what is the first thing that we did? We started an exploration where diverse teams assess the fit and feasibility of a usable innovation. So we had a representative group of stakeholders that came together to look at the research on mathematics instruction to clearly operationalize and define what does good quality effective math instruction look like in the state of Kentucky. From there, we moved into installation, where diverse teams co-created training, coaching, and data system measures. And so what we were looking at, are teachers being trained effectively on the use of the math practices? Are they being coached, and is the coaching effective? And is data use effective? From there, we moved into initial implementation where teachers are using the innovation, and then teams are going through plan, do, study, act cycles using implementation data to remove barriers and support teachers. And so in Kentucky, it took us 2 years to build the infrastructure to support teachers, and then we've been in initial implementation where teachers are using the effective practices over the course of 1 year. And then we have a district within our learning laboratory that's very close to achieving full implementation, whereas 80% of the district's schools are using the innovation with improved student outcomes. And so under optimal conditions where executive leader is fully supporting the process and providing adequate resources, we can expect for it to take 3 to 6 years to achieve full implementation. So our first district within our learning laboratory to have repeated capacity and fidelity measures. You can see this is their student benchmark assessment data that they do on math 3 times per year. You can see in the fall of 2017, they started with 21.5% of students achieving benchmark, and that moved up to 51% by the spring of 2018. So an overall increase of 29.5%. So the question is, does this translate to our state assessment data? And so again, going back to our goal, our first goal is to reduce novice performance. Because in Kentucky, on our statewide assessment, we score on a novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished scale. And we know that we have to reduce novice before we can increase proficiency. So this is our novice reduction data within our learning laboratory district and their learning laboratory school, with the first one that has had repeated measures. And you can see here that they reduced novice performance for all students as well as within all subpopulations within their school. And so specifically for students with disabilities, they had reduced novice by 5.7%. And you can see there are notable reductions in novice across all subpopulations. And then again, our goal was to reduce novice, but we are beginning to see some increases in proficiency with the same learning laboratory schools. So overall, we saw an increase in proficiency for all students as well as within these 2 subpopulations. And so all of the data that we've shared with you today is preliminary evidence to show that when we have networked implementation teams that come together to support teachers, we can begin to improve student outcomes. And as one of our teachers said within our learning laboratory, we are beginning to get data linking outcomes to use of an evidence-based practice.
Right. Finally, our third factor is of enabling context. In enabling context, we are really talking about how do we ensure that we are engaging stakeholders and in a co-creative process, and that is truly a co-creation and not just a collaboration or informing them, but we're engaging them in designing those implementation supports, helping to solve the problems, and we are also using data for continuous improvement. So that way we are creating an environment that is supportive to the use of the practice. We're engaging our stakeholders, we're creating a collaborative team to do that work, and we're using data for continuous improvement. Engaging in those actions of ensuring that there's a team accountable, that we're engaging stakeholders, and that we're using data for improvement also needs to be done with attending to the culture, the values, the histories, and the assets, and infusing an educational equity approach. Let's hear how New Jersey is attending to their enabling context with that equity lens.
Hello, my name is Phoebe Thomas, and I'm the state coordinator for the New Jersey Department of Education's Migrant and Homeless Education Programs. I'm also a state transformation specialist with the SISEP Initiative Partnership at the NJDOE. I want to take a few minutes to discuss the context of our state management team, who's represented, how they work together, and what voices are really at the table. At the New Jersey Department of Education, we have a very mighty cross-collaborative team. Represented on that state management team are the divisions of early childhood, student services, and academics. There we have an even further breakdown because we have a number of offices that are represented, including the Offices of Comprehensive Support, where our targeted and comprehensive schools are served, the Office of Supplemental Educational Programs, where at the state management team table we have Titles 1 and 3, the Office of Special Education, and then the Office of Student Support Services. Also on our team, we have 3 executive sponsors, 2 state transformation specialists, and approximately 10 to 12 state management team members. The team really works together like a well-oiled machine. Each member's input and advisement works in a cohesive manner to ensure that the focus area of our transformation zone, which is K-5 early literacy, is actually going to receive the greatest benefit. Each team member brings a level of expertise from their respective field, and that really helps to keep the entire team on track. The effective communication for moving this work forward is like none I've witnessed. Rarely do we get stuck in the weeds of what didn't work in the past in the department, but rather a better focus on what can become in the future for the populations that we serve. It's sort of like a dream come true to know that the work that we're doing within SciSEP can actually bring educational outcomes for all children and youth, and that really is exciting. Each team member is able to advocate for improving those educational outcomes for each of the populations that we support. But of course, we're doing that through the SciSEP lens, and thereby ensuring that systems change is for long term and not just some new fly-by-night initiative. With each team meeting, we are able to create greater buy-in. And that's one of the key points for systems change, shifting fixed mindsets to growth mindsets. Every voice is important at the state management team table for the work that we're doing here in New Jersey. And again, we just can't express enough how excited we are to see how, with each step along the way, we continue to grow and work together as a team. Thank you.
All right. Well, we thank you for joining us as we came together today to talk about equitable implementation and what does that look like in action. And hopefully you have benefited from hearing Amanda and Shimomi and Phoebe talk through what does equitable implementation look like in action on the ground from those that are engaged in every day of doing this work. We'd like to leave you with 3 reflection questions to kind of guide your thinking as you reflect on what you heard. So for example, what are your priorities around equity and commitment to equitable implementation? Are you ensuring that you're hearing from a variety of perspectives representative of your community and that you're centering the voices and the experiences of your stakeholders, especially attending to those groups that have been historically and currently marginalized when you're identifying the needs and the assets and selecting practices and defining them and planning and monitoring implementation? And the final question I encourage you to think about is, what data can you examine to understand where you are now and where do you need to focus on equity? Are data tools selected for appropriately matched to our community? Are you using disaggregated data to understand disparities in access, opportunities, and outcomes as you move forward? So I encourage you to think about those 3 questions and replay the videos as you need to in order to hear from, to go and reflect on what was heard from Shinobi and from Amanda and Phoebe in their stories as you go forward. And finally, for more information, we wanted to share some resources. We have the Stanford Social Innovation Review, just free, publicly available, did a special issue on attending to equity in implementation, as well as you have the SysUp website and the NERN website that has resources for you to explore as well. We hope that you will discover those and take action as you move forward in this incredible journey for educational equity and achieving those socially significant outcomes.